Well, good afternoon, one and all. It's good to be in this cosy little room. And it's like just sitting in front of the fireplace at home, isn't it? Medicine, theology, philosophy, law. Well, three of those apply to the discussion we're about to have, and probably the fourth as well, as we reflect upon the impact on this earthly dominion of what we choose to do with the environment broadly as its custodians, and particularly with our forests. I'm here principally to encourage this project. CDP is worthwhile. Why do I say that? I'm the son of a farmer. I grew up in rural Australia. My father was a timber getter. He cleared the land, and he did what most people did way back in the 1960s and 70s. And it's only with the reflection of the last 50 years and as the data slowly accumulates do we get a sense of what that means for the sustainability of our planet more broadly. Numbers matter. The fact that deforestation contributes 15% of total impact on greenhouse gas emissions commands respect. It therefore should command political and policy attention in terms of what we do about it. Often in global climate change negotiations, and I've been at a lot, I was at Copenhagen leading the Australian delegation. I still have the scar tissue and stigmata to show for that, secular stigmata anyway. And I was in a non-government capacity at Paris as well. Numbers matter. But on this question of what we do about forests, it often slides to one side in the core deliberations on carbon pricing and the rest of the economy. And it could not, and it should not, and it must not for the future. Because our ability to sustain our forests is fundamental to what we do with climate change, greenhouse gases, and sustainability more broadly. So when I look at your figures here at CDP, you're doing God's work, whoever she may be. And the fact that in 2016 you had 365 investors with 22 trillion in assets who were signatories to CDP, that in the same year, on behalf of these investors, you made requests of 825 global firms, and they were asked to provide data in terms of the impact of their activities in the 4 critical areas impacting on forests. And the fact that you had 20% of them actually respond is all a good start. But where the rubber really hits the road now, my friends, is the context in which we now find ourselves with the political changes which are occurring in this country of yours called the United States of America. What will happen when President Trump finally marches into the White House, we do not know. He may tweet about it beforehand in this sector. Depends how active we all are in social media and following him and responding to him. And we've seen the ambiguity of his statements so far in terms of what he'll actually do in terms of the Paris Accord. Out, in, ignore, partially ignore, putting a blind telescope to the eye, we do not know. But can I simply say this to all of you who are engaged in this sector? The bottom line is this: whatever the political temperature is in Washington, and whatever the political season may be in terms of this question, the planet doesn't lie, our forests don't lie, and the data doesn't lie. And climate change is real. You're looking at a guy who was elected to the Prime Ministership of Australia, the world's 12th largest economy, on the basis of bringing in a carbon price and bringing in a mandatory renewable energy price, target I should say, and a range of other climate-related measures. Our Senate defeated carbon pricing twice before we finally brought in a carbon tax. We introduced a mandatory renewable energy target of 20% of total energy supply to be delivered by renewables by 2020. This was back in 2008. And we're on target to do that. We're now up to something in the vicinity of 16%, heading towards 22% by that year. and a range of other measures, including subsidies for poor households to install solar panels on their roofs and a range of other energy efficiency measures as well. But politics interferes and it changes. In the 2013 election, I came second. In other words, I lost. And the Conservatives who replaced me were elected on a platform not dissimilar to what Mr. Trump has been elected on. Climate politics in Australia is about as ugly, difficult, problematic, nasty, brutal as I've discovered it is here in the United States of America, having lived here now for the last couple of years. And so the Conservatives who replaced me then repealed the carbon tax and therefore our carbon pricing regime. What is interesting, however, for me, and what I think is relevant to a gathering such as this, is that when government policy settings change, it is a setback. But the bottom line is there is such a fundamental, individual, social, community level, and corporate level, shareholder-driven, consumer-driven revolt on this question across the world that I don't believe significant policy settings, even by governments centrally, including in Washington and in Canberra, the capital of my own country, will decisively change the equation. There is too much by way of fundamental view in the community that this is a serious agenda for our generation, if we are faintly concerned about the well-being of the generation which follows us. And therefore in Australia, despite the fact they've now been 2 years without a carbon pricing regime, you still see high levels of consumer-driven, shareholder-driven, corporate-driven, investor-driven behavioural change. And so my encouragement to this gathering and the CDP who provide the mathematics on this, who provide the data on this, is long may you prosper, because I believe that whatever setbacks may occur at the policy level, that this revolution in corporate behaviour across the world will continue. Obviously, there'll be some firms who look at any policy change in Washington and will say, yippee, suddenly the yoke has been removed. But my sense of this country, having lived here for a while now, is that the data is now so all-pervasive in the community that it's going to take a very brave corporate indeed to turn a blind eye to the sort of reporting which will be provided by CDP on forests and more broadly on carbon emissions. When you look more broadly at the question of climate change, for me this is my first passion in public political life and in policy life. And when I look at what's unfolding globally, I am both encouraged, I'm discouraged, I'm frightened, and I'm energised all at once. And most of us who are human beings, I think, share a similar range of experience. But it is great that through Paris, and it is great through the agreement that we achieved on the Sustainable Development Goals September last year, that we now have a robust international policy framework for action on climate change. It's something we were not able to achieve in Copenhagen in 2009. But we must also apply levels of scrutiny into what was achieved in Paris as well. Number one, we have now independently determined national commitments. Of course, the nomenclature around that particular phrase changes and evolves, but essentially these are voluntary targets, agreed to by states, declared as independent annexures to the agreement, and to which they will then work, deploying a range of policy tools and mechanisms available to them. But if you look at the totality of the carbon reduction commitments contained in Paris, it barely goes 1/3, not even 1/2 the way to that which we need to go in order to keep temperature increases globally within 2 degrees centigrade by century's end. On current trajectories, it will rise to at least 3 degrees plus, if all the individual national commitments are in fact honoured. So therefore, a high level of ambition will be required at subsequent meetings of the Conference of the Parties to lift that ambition in order to bring greenhouse gas reductions within 2 degrees centigrade ceiling. But here it brings us now to the second problem. Even those commitments which have been registered, how do we know that they're actually doing it? And this brings us on to the global version, the universal version, the comprehensive version of what you are seeking to do within the forest sector in this CDP exercise. The whole question of measurement, reporting and verification for carbon emissions worldwide is now the centrepiece of global policy debate. Unless there is robust reporting on this, then frankly our exercises internationally among governments will turn into a paper exercise. Providing robust data on what is actually being achieved on the ground by nation states in honouring their international commitments under the Paris Agreement will become core business. And therefore, if you look at what happened at Marrakesh just a couple of weeks ago at the Conference of the Parties, the whole agenda has become one whereby what was in past a debate about the level of national commitments has now become a central debate about the future of MRV, measurement, reporting and verification. This must be resolved, because if it is not effectively resolved, then it runs a risk of interfering with the integrity of carbon markets as they evolve more generally. Which brings me to the further point I wanted to make to you this afternoon, and that concerns the wonderful world of finance. International agreements, such as the ones I've just been talking about, are worth precisely this in the absence of money: a piece of paper. Money makes things happen. Regulations do, but money operating within regulations or within shareholder-driven or consumer-driven behaviours is what matters and changes behaviour. If we extend the canvas beyond forests and look at the totality of carbon emissions across the world at large, the key thing is this: global public finance available through the global public development banks is not really much more than about 10 drops of water or 10 buckets of water in the ocean of finance which is necessary to bring about real change. I won't bore you with the figures, but in order to give effect to the Sustainable Development Goals, we're looking at a necessary additional investment in infrastructure across the world annually of between 2 and 3 trillion US. This cannot happen off the back of the global development banks, the World Bank and its associated banks, national development banks and the rest. The balance sheet is not sufficient to sustain 1/10 of that amount, in fact, more likely to be considerably less. Which means that, analogous to the debate we're having here on forests in your important discussions here today, is what therefore needs to be done to harness global private finance, both from national sources and from international sources on large-scale infrastructure projects which deal with energy emission or energy efficiencies more generally. And that means, therefore, that the sorts of disciplines you're seeking to apply in relation to the corporates and investors in the forest sector will need to be applied more generally to the entire, let's call it, carbon-generating sector of the economy. When you look carefully at what is actually happening on the ground, this is often talked about, that is the use of global private capital in order to make a difference with carbon emissions across the global economy. But when you sit down and speak to individual financial houses about what they're actually doing on the ground so far, the work is limited. I sit, for example, on the advisory board of Morgan Stanley, the Sustainability Advisory Board on Morgan Stanley. And there you have a private financial institution here in New York, here in this great country called America, seeking to do its best in terms of funding projects which have an ability to meet sustainability criteria, including the question of carbon. But I know from my own experience there that we are so much at the beginning of this process, and that is coming from a bank which has been so much at the forefront of this process in leading the debate amongst corporations and financial institutions in this country. So we are barely beginning. What we therefore need to do as a corporate community, as a finance community, as a general community, is get very practical and get down and dirty in terms of what specific financial products are going to work with what series of bankable sustainability projects in which countries, in which markets in the world in order to make a material difference. We are not talking about philanthropy here. Business models don't work on the basis of philanthropy. I've discovered this in politics. It just doesn't work that way. It's got to work in a material way, which means there is a shareholder return, there is a revenue return, there is a rate of return in order to justify the capital which has been invested. And so the practical challenge in evolving this set of bankable projects across this policy space is how do we provide cocktails of global public finance, national public finance, with global private finance and national private finance in order to manage the risk profile of so many of these projects so they can be delivered on the ground and make a material difference to sustainability and specifically to carbon emissions and more generally to climate change. That, I believe, is where the cutting edge of the work now lies. Anyone who sits back there in politics land and says, well, we've just had this great outcome in Paris, we've just agreed on the SDGs here in New York through the United Nations, and therefore we're just going to leave it to the World Bank to sort out the details, is dreaming. A material difference will be made on the basis of this entering into the mainstream of financial decision-making across the United States economy, across the global private economy more generally, with governments and corporates working hand in hand in order to deliver outcomes. That's the vision we need for the future. And that's why I'm so encouraged by the work you do here, specifically in this critical area of forests. So my responsibility here again today is simply to add a word of encouragement. This is doing serious work on the part of whoever it is who provided this creation for us, whatever her name may be, and making a material difference in the forest sector. As Prime Minister of Australia, we worked closely with our friends in Indonesia, we worked closely with our friends in Papua New Guinea. We're certainly familiar with what was unfolding in Brazil and other parts of African forest to know the real and material challenges here. And they are vast, they are huge, and I recognise that. But they are capable of being overcome. And they are capable of being overcome if finance ceases to be delivered to projects which are massively destructive of existing forest reserves, which brings us back to this discipline of mathematics, this discipline of dealing with shareholder sentiment, this discipline of dealing with consumer sentiment. So my friends, whatever happens in DC in the weeks and months and years ahead, then I simply wish this great country of yours Godspeed. But in this critical sector, I believe this popular response to what everyone senses in their daily lives at one level or another in terms of the warming of our planet, the impact on predictable weather events, the incidence and intensity of extreme weather events, and the other consequences of climate change have gone from the margins and in fact have entered into the mainstream of the discourse in Main Street America, in High Street England, and certainly in Broad Street Australia. In other words, I think this change in consciousness has now gone way beyond the political debate as formerly conducted between the political parties in our respective countries. It's gone way beyond, frankly, the interests which often fund the particular postures taken by individual political parties through campaign finance. I think the community at large, and through activities such as that supported by CDP, and more broadly through people just being concerned about their future, that this work will continue and gain in strength whatever the politics of Washington might be. I thank you so much for your time.